conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
And welcome, everybody, to an amazing Friday right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Of course, I'm your host, Andrew Cooperrider. This is your source for Kentucky politics. You know, a lot of shows will be talking about the national politics, obviously State of the Union, those kinds of things. That's not what we do here. Nope. I focus on the Kentucky issues, the issues you can actually make a difference on. I think that's what's so incredibly important about what we do here. And today we'll be discussing a lot of pieces of legislation that have been moving through the legislature, whether that's through committee hearings, floor votes, so on and so forth, kind of breaking down some pieces of that. I mean, we've got bills on, child care. We got bills on school buses. We got bills on power. We got bills on the Department of Education. We've got a shell bill where I can explain that process. So we've just got a lot to cover. So we'll have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. But first, to start us off, House Bill 18's veto has been overrode. For those of you unaware, House Bill 18 is a bill that bans locales like Lexington, Louisville, and other places that have adopted a policy of telling landlords in the area that they are not allowed to discriminate against people. Discriminate, used in, of course, a negative term here, as the lefties do. But anyways, discriminate against people based upon their source of payment for rent. And what they're talking about is that these cities like Lexington, Louisville, and others have been passing ordinances to mandate that landlords take Section 8 housing vouchers. They can't turn those down. And I've gone through a myriad of reasons of how this is absolutely ridiculous and how you're just going to cause rent to rise and you're going to cause deposits to become massive. And I went through this yesterday about how, your remedies for somebody destroys the house is basically take them to small claims court. But if they're on Section 8, they have no money. So how are you going to get paid for the damages that they've done to your home, right? They don't have any money. You can't get water from a rock. We've gone through, the psychological effect that people have when they're actually paying the rent themselves. We dug into that. We've dug into a myriad of issues, but all of it really deals with specifically a property rights issue. And of course, in Beshear's veto, and I'd mentioned this, he brought up his old favorite, the parable of the Good Samaritan, where he talks about how we've got to love everybody and treat our neighbor as our friend and love them. And that means in order to treat them as our neighbor and friend, we've got to take the property rights away from other people who I guess aren't our neighbors and friends, according to Beshear, and then give that property and the usage of it by force, the force of government, over to others. Because that's what the parable of the Good Samaritan teaches Beshear. Now, of course, he's ignoring parts of 2 Timothy in that. He's ignoring, obviously, the parable of talents. He's ignoring a lot of aspects of the Bible that does talk about welfare and to the degree of which we should be handing out welfare. But, that's, what do you expect, though? For people who think that, abortion is okay with the Bible, gay marriage is okay with the Bible, that they can have gay people involved in their church is holding leadership roles and that's okay, or they should be allowed to have gay weddings at churches should have gay weddings at them and should be forced to do so. Those kinds of thought processes that Beshear has, the guy who thinks that aligns with his biblical values to allow children to be chemically castrated and sex change operations and cutting off body parts. That guy, of course, isn't going to read all of the Bible, so I don't expect him to exactly understand it. But House Bill 18 was overrode by the legislature, and now that is going to set up an interesting potential fight between Lexington and Frankfort and Louisville and Frankfort and many other of these more liberal cities. Because the question is, are they going to relinquish their ordinance, or are they not going to? Okay, so this is going to play out one of a few ways, right? Now, Lexington as a city could potentially try to sue against said bill, try to get it injunctified, so on and so forth, spending taxpayer funds. That's a process they could go through. They could fight it, or they could do something else, and they could continue, and I think this might be likely possibly what they do if they continue to keep this law in place in Louisville and Lexington is they could go to the landlords and say, you know what, we don't feel like paying to fight this. We're not going to spend our taxpayer dollars on it. We're going to make you pay to fight it. And so what would happen is the city would come in and try to enforce this ordinance on somebody as soon as they can find somebody to do it to, and then they'll take that person to court, and then that person has to pay for attorneys and as such, and would reference House Bill 18 as to why the case should be dismissed. And the case would probably be very quickly dismissed and ruled unconstitutional, or not unconstitutional, but the law would be ruled inaccurate in this situation. But the landlord would still have to come out of pocket to pay for that lawyer. And so they're really just setting this up. They're turning housing into a giant fight in Lexington, Louisville, because they put in place regulations that ignore property rights, regulations that will only raise the cost of housing for everybody else because rents will go higher, deposits will go higher, because the landlords have to make up for the fact that they're going to have people in there that could destroy the place and they have no other way to recoup their losses. And now they're going to throw on top of that extra litigation costs. It looks like that's a possibility. They'd throw in on top of that litigation costs. Absolutely, positively ridiculous and does not spell a good future for us there as far as land. They're literally doing everything they can to make housing worse. And meanwhile, Kentucky, Lexington especially, isn't doing anything to make housing better. Let me explain something that happens. Okay, if Lexington really wants to make housing better, housing more affordable and cheaper in Lexington, they could stop doing things and get out of their own way. They could decide what kind of town or city do they want to be. Do they want to be a small city? Do they want to be a big city? Do they want to grow or not grow? What do I mean? Well, the city of Lexington engages in something called PDR. That's called property development rights. And what they do is they come in and as you're driving around, you may see these signs up along farms in Fayette County that says PDR, P as in Papa, D as in Delta, R as in Romeo, PDR farm on a sign, protected farm on a sign. What that means is the city has come in, taken tax dollars, and then gave that to the landowner and said, you cannot, this has to say an agricultural farm. So they want these farms to remain the rolling hills and the green and everything else. And so they're taking tax dollars and they're buying up these property development rights. In the year of 2021, the city of Lexington spent around $10 million buying up these property development rights. On top of spending taxpayer dollars buying up property development rights, and that being a waste, what they're also doing is it stops these parcels of land from being taken and turned into subdivisions or apartment housing or what have you. And so that inevitably means that the housing will be more expensive because there's less housing on the market, right? If you want to meet demand, well, then you have to bring in housing. That's what you have to do, or you're going to run people out of town. But Lexington is in, and many towns and cities all across Kentucky are dealing with this same problem. They can't decide what do they want to be. You cannot simultaneously stay this, oh, we want this aesthetic of rolling farms and beautiful hills and everything else, but we also want to continue growing and be a big city, but we also want to have cheap housing. It's impossible to do all three. In the attempt to do all three, you're making a city for nobody. You're making a city where the property is so expensive in that these rural farms and everything else, literally the property taxes, their properties are worth tens of millions of dollars. They can't afford to keep paying for this. Bluegrass conspiracy. Anyways, they can't afford to keep paying for it. Meanwhile, the people living within the city that don't own these farms, their housing keeps getting more and more expensive because there's not enough housing on the market for all the people moving in. You're literally building a city for nobody. And instead of recognizing that and taking steps to fix it, instead, they're going to try, most likely, to fight the Kentucky Legislature passing a bill that would protect property rights of owners. Absolutely ridiculous. Well, coming up after this, we'll be digging into a lot of bills that are moving through our legislature. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. So we've got a number of bills I want to cover today that's going through our legislature. First, let's start off with House Bill 461 being voted on in the House. which actually passed the House. House Bill 461 is to deal with school buses, and it would allow them to put cameras on the stop arm. So, when buses stop and then and they're letting off kids and they have that stop sign that folds out to let the school districts, it was mandated. Now it's just may. And so the mandation part of this is taken away. So they could put cameras on buses in order to capture when people decide they're going to go around a bus with its stop sign out. And so that way they could be issued tickets. Basically, it's kind of a remote enforcement. Now, I don't exactly know how this complies per se with a law we have on our books here in Kentucky that says that you can't use like electronic monitoring, like cameras and as such for enforcement, for the law enforcement side of things. So you can't use like red light cameras and speed cameras and those kinds of things in order to do, basically a technological enforcement of traffic laws. So I don't know how this complies with that exactly. But anyway, so the school bus cameras would go on these stop arms, and then if you run that bus's stop sign, you could find yourself getting a ticket. But it also adds a thing on there that it's also now against the law, if this bill passes the Senate, to not stop on highways that don't have divided medians. To give you an example, so if you all ever drive in Lexington, like Versailles Road, Versailles Road is like a 5-lane road. It's got 2 lanes going one way, a middle turn lane, and then 2 lanes going the other way. And right now, if a bus stops to let out kids off Versailles Road, the other lanes can keep coming because that's like a highway. And buses wouldn't let kids out and then have them walk across 4-5 lanes of traffic in order to get to their houses. Well, now it would say that you have to stop. So now if you're on the other side, you would have to stop for that bus unless there is a divided median like grass or some sort of barrier between you and the bus. Otherwise, you have to stop for a bus, even if it's 6 lanes away from you, and no bus in their right mind would ever be letting out kids. So that is something to be aware of with House Bill 491. It's making its way through. I'm sorry, 461. It's making its way through. And now I want to take a moment to talk about House Bill 491. Sorry, I've got my list here. I confused the two for a second there. But House Bill 491. This is super duper interesting bill because it was something, I didn't really realize that this loophole existed. I guess I knew it existed, but I realized it existed in more depth as I was reading through this bill. And then a good friend of mine happens to be involved in a martial arts studio and running a martial arts studio. So I was able to call him and kind of ask about some of these questions. So right now, so after school programs, daycare programs, everything else, they have regulations from the state, such as, if it's in a type 1 center, it has to have, somebody with an associate's degree in running a center or like with a lot of experience running the center. Everybody's got to be background checked, TB tested, certain certifications. And then there's also rules about ratios. And so, you've got to have one instructor for every 20 people or one teacher for every 15. It depends on the size, of course, of the group. It depends on the age of the kids, so on and so forth. So there's all these regulations regarding childcare. However, apparently in our law now, there is an exemption. So if you are a facility that teaches this is the current law, teaches a single talent or skill or to kids. So talent, skill, instructional thing, but you teach like one single thing, you now are exempt from all childcare regulations. So if you've ever seen these martial arts vans that are picking up kids from schools and offer this after school program, and I've always wondered, like, man, that's like a lot of them, and that's a lot of karate. Why are they doing this? Well, it appears that this is the reason why, is that they're actually working this loophole in regulations because they're saying, well, we are teaching a single skill, that's karate or martial arts or whatever, and therefore they now are exempt from all childcare regulations, meaning they don't have to have a person with that degree. They don't have to do background checks. They don't have to do the TB test. They don't have to do any of that. No group size restrictions go out the window. The only regulation generally is occupancy and those kinds of things. And so this bill actually expands that loophole out from saying a single skill or program or, that kind of teaching, right? So if you could be like, I guess, a math academy maybe, and you're just teaching only math. And so it takes away a single skill to just a skill or some kind of teaching group or facility. So it's really interesting that they take out the word single, because in practice, it would appear that by expanding that loophole out, you would have places like YMCA or others that now could offer an after-school program. Now, these programs, in order to qualify for the loopholes, it has to be after school. Can't take place during normal school hours, but it can take place after school, over the summer. It can take place all over the place, right? And so, like I said, there's no requirements as far as ratios go. And so by expanding that out, you could see places like the YMCA that could now offer a slate of classes that your kids could take. But as long as they're teaching your kids something, even if that's, math homework that goes along with, so they could be literally doing an entire tutoring program. They could be teaching them Pilates. They could be teaching them karate. They could be teaching them fencing. They could be teaching them dodgeball. As long as they're, quote unquote, teaching them something that I guess, and it's after school, and they're now not a daycare because of it, because they're teaching them all these things, this loophole now applies. Which begs the question, what is the actual use of these regulations in the first place? Other than driving up our costs of childcare. I mean, just think about it, okay? We have all these regulations, all right? And then right now in current law, the moment you put a gi and a belt on a kid, all of a sudden, all these regulations go out the window. It doesn't matter what they're actually doing. We put a gi on them, we put a belt on them, and we occasionally teach them karate. And I've know people that have their kids in these programs. They're doing things like playing dodgeball and claiming that's a part of karate because you're learning hand-eye coordination or what have, I mean, those kinds of things, right? But because the kid's wearing a gi and a belt, well, now it doesn't have to follow any of these regulations. And what's that tell us? That tells us that these regulations are overwrought, because you're not hearing a large, massive call to close these loopholes because there's not been a problem. So clearly that means that the regulations themselves are too much in the first place. I mean, outside of perhaps requiring background checks to work with children, what in the list of things makes a lot of sense in these regulations? I mean, follow me here, okay? And if you say, Andrew, I disagree. I think these regulations are important. Just follow me here, okay? Let's say I want to run an after-school program for kids. So at the age of 7, okay, for 7-year-olds, right? So that'd be like kindergarten, first grade. So at the age of 7, current regulations say you have to have one, if you're running a day, like a daycare, you have to have one staff member for 15 kids, okay? So let me ask you this, right? Let's say I run a program that's really, really cheap. And it's so cheap because I will kick a kid out if they are not well behaved. If a kid's a problem, they're immediately getting kicked out. I'm not dealing with it. We only want children who act right, who are behaved, that know how to behave themselves, so that way we don't need as much intervention. But in return, I charge less because I need less staff to watch a bunch of 7-year-olds in a room. Because think about it, okay? You may think, well, 15-1, that's a pretty close ratio. First off, that's not even our teacher-to-student ratio in schools. Let's keep that in mind. Second off, if we're talking about 2 to 3 hours, we're not talking about all day. We're talking about 2 to 3 hours. They're in a room. It's child-proof. They've got toys and things to play with other kids. You got a movie on. Maybe you just got a kid's bathroom in that area. But otherwise, they're pretty locked down. They can't go outside of this area. And they can play with other kids. They got the bathroom. Throw a movie on. It's 2 to 3 hours. And if that's the case, a 1 to 20, even possibly a 1 to 30 ratio may not be too hard to pull off if the kids are well behaved. I have children. Remember, guys, I have children. So let's play this thought experiment here, okay? So right now it's 1 to 15, all right? Would you rather have, and would you feel safer with, would you rather have 20 really well-behaved 7-year-olds or 10 badly behaved 7-year-olds? If you're doing childcare, which would you rather have? And I think everybody, your gears are starting to turn. You're like, well, geez, I'd rather have 20 very well-behaved 7-year-olds, or at least you should, if you're thinking through this the right way. So if you'd rather have 20 very well-behaved 7-year-olds, but according to current law, you ain't allowed to do that. But you could have the 10 badly behaved 7-year-olds, a situation that's even worse and possibly more dangerous. And that's what I mean by these regulations don't necessarily make a whole lot of sense to me. I think a lot of these childcare regulations are overwrought. We have this Horizons Act coming through where they're like, whoa, childcare is a big problem. We need to dump $300 million into it, instead of first maybe looking at what are we doing with our regulations? What are we doing to create situations where childcare has become massively expensive? Are we artificially raising the cost because we're putting in place regulations that don't make a whole heck of a lot of sense? Are we causing problems by, in one situation, if you're in a daycare and you do after school program, it's this much, but the minute we throw them, like I said, into a karate class every day for 2 to 3 hours, a karate class, those, you guys can't see me, I'm doing my quotation fingers, a karate class, we throw them in a karate class and now it's like, whatever. What do you got there, 50 kids to one person? Oh, it's okay. Does leave some questions. Well, coming up, we'll be continuing to dig into important pieces of legislation. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. So we've continuing on covering pieces of legislation that are kind of moving through our state legislature. I've covered a few different bills, just conversation about it, commentary on it. Let's switch over to the Senate real quick, because I want to make sure I cover this before I run out of time today. Senate Bill 349 was in committee. Now, what Senate Bill 349 does is it's to create something called the EPIC Committee, and that's an acronym. And basically what the EPIC Committee's duty is to look at the electrical providing situation in Kentucky. That's kind of the push for it. And so let me explain this. Let's rewind. Let's rewind to last year real quick. Okay, so there is currently in Kentucky a commission that's basically in charge of approving, disapproving, and handling the regulatory processes of our power production. So like for an example, if you're a power company and you want to shut down a plant, open a plant, so on and so forth, this public commission, it's called, what is it? CPE, I believe it's called, is the acronym for it. But this public commission, utility commission, they have to sign off, approve, or disapprove. So last year, there was this big issue with this public service, PSC, that's what it's called, Public Service Commission, sorry, PSC. There's this big issue last year where a few of our electricity producers, like KU, wanted to shut down 2, I believe, of their coal plants and replace them with natural gas and other sources. And this was like an ongoing battle back and forth, a lot of intervening parties, and the commission kept sitting on it and waiting on it until, and I'm not kidding you, like the day after the governor's election. So the day after the governor's election, like the day after, they issue a ruling then saying that they're going to be shutting down the coal plants, because obviously Beshear didn't want to be losing any possible votes he could have gotten out east, because this is obviously an executive branch commission, and that would have been a bad look for Beshear, saying his administration is shutting down coal plants. That would have lost him votes out in eastern Kentucky, and so he made sure to wait until the day after, well, not he, but the commission, wait until the day after the election to announce they would be allowing the shutdown of these coal plants. So obviously this PSC Public Service Commission has already been heavily politicized. That's the first thing you got to understand. Okay, here's the second thing. Electricity generation has become very political just in general. Okay, and we can thank Biden and the federal government for why it's getting so bad now. But it's just basically a fact and this is just a fact. I can't change it. This is a fact. Coal-powered plants are the cheapest, most reliable, just raw producer of electricity. It's just cheap and it's reliable. That's why China is building like new coal plants left and right. They're not building solar or gas or wind or nuclear. They're not building nuclear. They're building coal-fired plants like often, like more than like one a month. And the reason why is because the power is so cheap and reliable. So if coal-fired plants are so cheap and reliable, why is it then that power plants are wanting to shut down coal-fired plants, even here in Kentucky? How is it? And the argument that they make is that coal is becoming too expensive for the ratepayers. The cheapest thing for them to do for the ratepayers, especially, is to adapt to natural gas. So why is it that coal-fired plants are becoming so expensive to run in the U.S. and Kentucky, while things like natural gas and others are becoming preferable when on the worldwide level, coal is the cheapest? And that is because the Biden administration, the federal government, is specifically trying to make coal as expensive or more expensive than things like natural gas and solar and wind in order to get the market to shift over to these renewables and clean energy sources rather than coal. Because left to their own devices, with just pure market conditions, these power plants will be choosing coal left and right. So knowing that, he says, well, we have to now artificially rise and drive up the cost of coal-fired plants in order to make it a financial incentive to switch. However, though the artificial costs are being increased from the government, and the cheapest thing to do is switch to things like natural gas, solar, and wind. So while that may be the cheapest option for ratepayers, it isn't the most reliable. As we'll keep in mind that the prices of these renewables and clean energy, once again, it's not being lowered because the market's getting better. No. That isn't why people are switching, because they're getting more efficient. It's because coal is artificially being rose in cost by the Biden administration. So sure, it's cheaper for ratepayers, but still to be on these renewables or natural gas, but still the overall cost of what you're paying is going up because they didn't lower renewables down to coal levels. They rose coal up to renewable levels. So what does this EPIC group that the legislature is trying to get together, once again, that's just its acronym, what's it going to do here? Well, they believe that the Public Service Commission, and I'm getting into their heads here, but they believe the Public Service Commission being politicized, and the fact that they're only really looking at ratepayer costs and then also the federal government regulations and the mandates to be green energy, they're saying, well, we need, we're going to be switching you over to these renewables. But they're not actually very reliable. I mean, let's look at California. Let's look at other states that have decided to switch these renewables, these natural gas. They're having brownouts, they're having blackouts, and we're starting to see that here in Kentucky, issues with that. And so rather than having this commission only looking at things like cost and then the regulations and then this kind of green energy initiative, the legislature is trying to make this EPIC group to kind of be over the PSC, the Public Service Commission, in order to basically approve the things they're doing while also bringing in other information. And their mandate is to look for reliability as well as low cost in order to fight the blackouts and the brownouts while also still trying to bring the prices lower. So they think that basically they're saying that this green mandate going only after green, this is kind of me getting in their head, is bad for Kentucky. It loses coal jobs, but then also it's creating these brownouts and blackouts. It's unreliable. And so we need to diversify. We need to have coal. We need to have this. We need to have that. They say diversify, but really they probably want more coal involved because it also keeps our economy in Eastern Kentucky going a little bit better. So what they're trying to do with Senate Bill 349 is put a weight back on the scale towards things like coal, and in a way they're fighting this leftist energy agenda. So it seems like a pretty good bill, but here's a reason to not like the bill. So I kind of broke it down and I kind of gave you the argument for the bill. Here's a reason not to like it. This adds a lot more bureaucracy, cost. You're stacking commission on top of commission on top of commission. And personally, I don't quite understand why we can't just change the makeup and the process of the Public Service Commission instead of creating a whole nother bureaucracy and group commission on top of that bureaucracy coming from the Public Service Commission. It just doesn't make sense to me. And I get it. If we're fighting back against the federal government, we're fighting back against these green energy initiatives, we want to make sure we have reliability there. That's all great. Change the current bureaucracy, then don't add more to it. That's a reason maybe to not like Senate Bill 349. On the subject of fighting back against the federal government, there is an interesting battle maybe looming. We have a House joint resolution to declare Kentucky a sanctuary state from EPA regulations on fossil fuels. That's another way of kind of tipping that scale. It's fascinating and interesting. We hear people talk about, how reliant Kentucky is on the Fed all the time, but we don't talk about why is it that Kentucky is so reliant on the Fed? Well, it's because the federal government systematically has destroyed Kentucky's industry. They destroyed hemp through federal regulations. They destroyed tobacco through federal regulations, and they're destroying coal through federal regulations. It is the federal government that has continued through regulations to push Kentucky down. And so it's interesting to see the state taking some steps to push back against that federal government and say, you know what, we want off this federal dole, but in order to do that, we have to break free from your regulations that are keeping us down. Well, coming up after this, we'll be digging into a few other important pieces of legislation. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Before the break, I was talking about a few pieces of legislation. We're going to continue on down this road. I'd ended on a House joint resolution. We do have a House concurrent resolution that made its way through the Education Committee. And what the House concurrent resolution would do is to form a task force within LRC, Legislative Research Commission, basically a task force, a out-of-session task force of legislators and other members of the public in order to take a look at basically JCPS. I mean, it says any school district, but they're talking about JCPS here. And they're trying to really analyze all the different data points and problems and then put together a list of fixes for the General Assembly, for the legislature to look at passing in order to fix the Jefferson County Public Schools, because they do, in fact, have a gigantic issue. They spend more money than any other district in the state, and it's not even close. It is by a lot. Per student funding at JCPS, Jefferson County Public Schools, is well over $20,000 a student. When you go to Fayette County, you see it around 17. Jessamine County is right around 14 to 15. Garrett County is right around 12 or 13. But Jefferson County Public Schools is above $20,000 a student. So while they're spending so much, their budget is well over $1 billion a year. And so while they're spending so much, this school district is incapable and so run so incompetently that it can't do basic things like get kids to school. I mean, you may remember this school session, this school year started off with Jefferson County Public Schools having to cancel like the first week of school because they decided, I guess, for the first time ever to run their bus routes the day of the first day of school. These new bus routes created by some new bus route making company that had already been fired from several cities. But regardless, they hired it anyways to make bus routes. And then they ran these brand new routes on that first day. And then they realized that they were unworkable. They didn't make sense. And people ended up getting to school like 2-3 hours late. They ended up getting home at 9 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night. Like absolutely ridiculous. And it was such a mess. They had to cancel schools. They couldn't handle transporting the Head Start program because there was just too much going on there. And so anyways, long story short, that their busing situation, absolute debacle. they can't even get kids to school. And then once they get kids to school, well, assuming the kids show up too, because they apparently can't enforce anything to do with attendance. They have a massive problem with attendance, with vast amounts of their students missing, multiple days a month, unexcused absences, just not showing up. And then they can't do other things once kids are there, like, teach them to read or do math, or, you got kids who are very unruly. I mean, the worst schools in the state, like the 10 worst schools in the state, were all in Jefferson County public schools. It's just absolutely ridiculous. They're not doing their job of educating kids so that way they can, learn things. And so what is the state to do? To continue to allow a district that spends taxpayer funds from all over the state through government funding programs? I mean, they're using funds from the state constantly. That's being funded by everybody in the state. They are failing, of course, to create kids that can function and contribute in Kentucky. So that means we end up with costs being passed around to the rest of the state as well, such as welfare and, those programs that end up having to be given to them because they can't, make their own money. You end up with things like prison systems being full because, these kids never learned how to act right. They're never taught anything, and they just become criminals at these schools because the schools can't keep a tamp down on crime. And then those things end up affecting the entire state. You end up with tax rates higher, spending ends up being more and more money gets dumped into this black pit that is Jefferson County Public Schools, and they're not fixing it. So what do? Do you let the district drag the entire state down like an anchor, as well as Louisville, destroy Louisville in the process? Or do you step in? And so that's what the legislature is looking at doing, is saying, we're going to have to step in here. You're burning through way too much money. We give you money. You're an entity of the state, whether you like it or not. People are mandated to go to you, basically. So we're going to have to fix this. And so this was brought before the Education Committee. Very interesting hearing, because Marty Polo, the superintendent for Jefferson County Public Schools, showed up to, talk about how against this he was. And he goes, well, it's funny. He goes, you guys, I'm coming up here and the legislators are telling me that we're disciplining kids not enough. And then meanwhile, I got the federal government coming down on us for disciplining kids too much. And it was funny because Representative Emily Callaway, came back to him and asked on that subject, were they looking at the entire student body, or what were they looking at? And he ended up admitting that that's the federal government saying that they were not punishing, they're punishing their quote unquote minority kids harsher than their white kids. Nothing to do with character, just they were looking at their skin color, of course. There's another pretty good moment where Representative Shane Baker, during vote explanation, called Polo, because Polo was up there saying, we can handle this, we can do it, we'll take that in from you guys, you can trust me. And Baker goes, last year, you stood up here and you told us that you would follow this state law that we passed. We pass it, and then you end up creating policies to fight against it. Frankly, you've lied. I don't think he said lied to us, but he's like, frankly, you've already proven you can't be trusted, so I'm voting yes. And that was fantastic. Now, there was only one Republican on the entire committee that voted no. And who do you think that was? I'll give you a hint. It's the one that's bought and paid for by the school districts, and that would be Representative Killian Timoney. He's being bankrolled by the teachers union, specifically the Jefferson County public schools teachers unions. They announced they'd be dumping $100,000 into 4 races, and the only race that they're dumping the money into with an incumbent, it appears, is Representative Killian Timoney. That's the only race they're dumping money into to defend an incumbent. Why? Because he votes the way they need him to. And so when it came time, now the process for voting is whenever you want to cast a vote, you can say you want to explain your vote. And so that way, if something kind of looks like it might be bad optics, or you think there's a greater issue there, you can say, I'm voting no, and here's the reason why. So it gets entered into the record, and then you can reference that if your constituents ask you why you did something. So when it came around to Representative Killian Timoney to vote, did he explain why he voted no? No, he didn't. Why didn't Representative Killian Timoney need to explain why he voted no? Because We all know the reason why. You're bought and paid for by the Jefferson County Public Schools teachers unions. They obviously don't want the state getting involved, because if the state gets involved, they might end up saying, hey, teachers and administrators, do your jobs. And that's something they definitely don't want to be told to do, to actually do their job of teaching kids. They can't have that. And so therefore, Killian Timoney had to vote no, because they're buying him. That's who his vote belongs to. Keep in mind, he also works a day job, quote unquote day job, as a higher up position in Fayette County Public Schools in facilities. While also, for some reason, while he's doing that, he's allowed to take 4 months off a year while in session to do whatever. So of course, he doesn't need to explain why he voted no. He's at least acknowledged that now by not explaining it. We all know why. It's because that is who you serve. You serve the school. You don't serve your constituents, Killian Timoney. You serve the schools. Because when you look at it, what other reason do you have for voting no outside of you didn't have a good one? That's why you couldn't explain your vote. Well, y'all, we've got to be wrapping up this week here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We covered a lot of important topics. Next week, we'll be digging into it as well. I do want to encourage you, make sure you're sharing out the show with others. If you're listening on WZXI, 9 a.m. Monday through Friday, make sure you're telling others, hey, make sure you tune in to WZXI at 9 a.m. and you can listen to this show every day. And if you're not on WZXI, well, make sure you're telling others about the podcast version. That comes out at 1 p.m. Monday through Friday. And you can refer people over to theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's theandrewshow.com as a good place for them to see where to listen to it, where to tune into. And then, as always, if you want to reach out to the show, feel free to email me at info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that is info@theandrewshow.com. I got a lot of emails this week from people on topics they want me to cover. I've covered a few of them. A few topics I've covered this week have come from emails, but we'll continue to cover more, going into next week. But otherwise, y'all have a great rest of your day. I hope you have a great weekend. We'll see you back here Monday, right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Till then, we'll be seeing you.